Hey everyone, get this. I was doing some research for today, and I came across this blog post called Autism and Scoliosis, a complex connection. It's from a website called Cheap ABA, and honestly, I had no idea these two things were even remotely related, but the more I read, the more fascinated I got.
Yeah, it's definitely a link that catches people off guard. Most people think of autism as, well, primarily affecting social interaction, communication, things like that. Not so much physical health. But the reality is everything in our bodies is interconnected. And today we're going to kind of dive into that, how autism and scoliosis might be related.
Okay, so before we get into that, can we start with some definitions? Autism, for instance, I know it's a spectrum, but are there any common characteristics that we should be aware of?
Absolutely, you're right. It does present differently in every individual, but a common thread is that difficulty with social interaction, communication. You might also see things like repetitive behaviors
Yeah.
or like intense interest in specific topic.
Gotcha. And how about scoliosis? What's actually going on there?
So scoliosis is basically an abnormal sideways curvature of the spine. Instead of a straight line, the spine might curve into like an S shape or a C shape. Imagine like a sapling that's grown kind of crooked instead of just straight up. It's diagnosed most often in adolescence, but it can actually develop at any age.
Oh, wow. I'm picturing that S shape now. Doesn't sound very comfortable.
Yeah.
So we've got these two seemingly like totally distinct conditions, but this blog post is saying they're connected. Where do we even start to make sense of that?
Well, one of the main theories revolves around muscle tone. See, a lot of people with autism have differences in their muscle tone. Some might have what's called hypertonia, which is excessive muscle tension. Imagine like trying to stand up straight when your muscles are constantly tense, like really tight springs.
Yeah, I get that.
Others might have hypotonia where the muscles are too relaxed. It's almost like trying to balance with like overstretched rubber bands.
Oh, okay. Those are really good analogies. It makes sense that that kind of muscle imbalance could affect
Yeah.
posture, maybe even lead to scoliosis.
Yeah. Exactly. When your muscles aren't working together properly, it can put stress on the spine, and that makes it more likely to curve, abnormally. And then on top of that, you have to factor in lifestyle.
Right. The blog post mentioned sedentary lifestyles. Is that what we're talking about now?
It is, and it's something that it really impacts a lot of kids these days. We're living in a world of screens. It's easy to get caught up in it, especially for children with autism who might find comfort or focus in those kinds of repetitive activities.
Oh, now tell me about it. I could lose hours scrolling myself. But how does that connect to scoliosis?
Well, all that sitting can weaken the back muscles, the ones that are essential for good posture. If those muscles aren't strong enough to support the spine, it's more likely to develop that curve. So it's like a domino effect.
Yeah.
Autism, more sedentary behavior, increased risk of scoliosis.
Oh, so interesting how it all like fits together.
Yeah.
Oh, and we can't forget about sensory sensitivities, right? The blog post mentioned those too.
You're absolutely right. That's where things get even more complex. And it's something a lot of people don't even consider. Like, imagine you're a child who's super sensitive to touch, certain textures. The feeling of grass on their skin might be unbearable, or the seams in their socks might feel like sandpaper.
Yeah, now that you mention it, I remember reading about a kid who couldn't stand the feeling of grass on his bare feet. He would only walk on pavement.
Exactly. Those kinds of sensory experiences can make physical activity really challenging, if not impossible. And for kids who are sensitive to things like fluorescent lights or loud noises, a typical gym environment can be overwhelming, stressful. So they might avoid those places altogether and miss out on opportunities to build those strong back muscles that are so crucial for preventing scoliosis.
It's like it's a vicious cycle. Their sensory sensitivities prevent them from doing things that could help. It's not their fault.
Right, and it highlights how interconnected everything is and why it's so important to approach health holistically.
Absolutely. So much of this comes down to understanding those individual needs, right?
100%. There's no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to supporting individuals with autism. We have to meet them where they are, respect their sensory preferences, and find ways to make movement enjoyable and accessible for them.
This is really eye-opening, I think, before reading this research. I probably would have just assumed scoliosis was purely genetic. But knowing that lifestyle, even sensory sensitivities can play a part, it really changes my perspective.
It definitely shows that our physical and mental well-being are deeply intertwined, and for people with autism, understanding these nuances can make a huge difference in their quality of life. But before we get into that, let's talk about what parents and individuals can do if they suspect scoliosis might be an issue. Early detection is key, wouldn't you say?
For sure. But before we get to that, let's take a quick pause so you can absorb all this. We've covered a lot. We'll be back in a flash to delve into early detection.
And what you can do to support healthy development. Don't go anywhere. And we're back. So before the break, we were talking about early detection. What should parents and individuals be looking out for?
Well, first and foremost, regular checkups with a pediatrician or an orthopedic specialist are really important. They're trained to spot those signs, even subtle ones, of spinal curvature. They'll also check for things like, uneven shoulders or hips. Those can be indicators of scoliosis, too.
Got it. And what if scoliosis is diagnosed? What happens next?
Well, the good news is there are several treatment options, and surgery is usually only considered in severe cases.
Okay, phew, that's good to know. So what are the different approaches? Like, what's the least invasive option?
Well, if the scoliosis is mild, the doctor might just recommend monitoring it over time, see if it progresses. It's kind of like, watching a plant grow. You check on it regularly to make sure it's developing as expected. Okay, so observation first, and then what?
If the curvature is more pronounced but not severe enough for surgery, bracing is often the next step.
Bracing, huh?
Yeah.
What does that involve?
A brace is basically like a supportive shell that helps guide the spine in the right direction as the child grows. It might sound a little daunting, but bracing has actually been proven to be really effective in many cases.
Wow, it's amazing how much technology has advanced. But what about those severe cases where surgery is necessary? What can people expect then?
Well, in those situations, the surgery aims to correct the curvature and prevent further complications. It can be a big decision, of course, but thankfully, surgical techniques have come a long way, and outcomes are generally very positive.
That's reassuring. So we've talked about the what of scoliosis, but I'm curious about the why. What's actually happening that causes these spinal curvatures, especially in the context of autism.
That's a great question, and that's where the research is still ongoing. We've talked about muscle tone and lifestyle factors, but there are other interesting areas being explored, like the role of connective tissue, for instance.
Connective tissue, what's that all about?
Well, think of connective tissue as the scaffolding that holds our bodies together. It's in our ligaments, tendons, even our bones. And there's some evidence suggesting that individuals with autism might have differences in their connective tissue, which could contribute to spinal instability and make them more susceptible to scoliosis.
So it's like the foundation of their musculoskeletal system might be different.
Exactly. And this kind of ties back to our earlier discussion about understanding individual needs. If we know that someone might have these underlying differences in the connective tissue, we can tailor therapies and interventions to support them.
It sounds like there's still a lot more research needed in this area.
Absolutely. There's so much we still don't know. But that's what makes this field so fascinating. Every new discovery opens up more avenues for understanding and support.
All right, speaking of support, what can parents, caregivers, educators do to create environments that promote healthy development and potentially reduce the risk of scoliosis?
Well, that's where we can all play a part. And it goes beyond just focusing on physical activity. It's about fostering a sense of well-being
Yeah.
and addressing those sensory sensitivities we were talking about earlier.
Okay, so give us some practical examples. How can we make movement more enjoyable and accessible for kids who might be struggling with sensory overload?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's about finding activities that match their interests and sensory preferences. Instead of pushing a child who hates loud noises into a crowded gym, maybe explore quieter options like swimming, where the water provides that calming, regulating sensation. Or look into yoga or Tai Chi, things that offer gentle movements and a focus on mindfulness.
I love that. It's about respecting their sensory needs, making movement a positive experience, not stressful. Any other tips?
Sometimes it's about making small adjustments to make activities more accessible. Like if a child is sensitive to fluorescent lights, maybe find a park or a playground with natural lighting, or look for classes that are held in studios with dimmer lighting.
So work with their sensitivities, not against them.
Exactly. And remember, building strength and good posture doesn't always require organized sports or formal exercise. You can incorporate movement into everyday routines. Encourage walking or biking to school instead of driving. Take the stairs instead of the elevator.
Those are great everyday ideas. I think sometimes we overcomplicate things when the simplest solutions are right there in front of us.
I agree. And remember to model those healthy habits yourself. If kids see the adults in their lives prioritizing movement and enjoying it, they're more likely to embrace it too. It's all about creating a culture of well-being.
This has been a really eye-opening conversation. We've gone from this seemingly simple connection between autism and scoliosis to this much deeper understanding of how our bodies and minds interact.
It really highlights the importance of taking a holistic approach to health, considering all the factors that contribute to well-being.
Absolutely. We've covered so much today. And before we wrap things up, I want to give you a moment to process everything we've discussed. We'll be right back to leave you with some final thoughts and inspiration to carry forward. Don't go anywhere. We're back. I feel like we've learned so much in this deep dive. What about you?
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's been really interesting.
So as we wrap things up, is there like one final thought you want to leave our listener with? Something they can kind of, mull over after the episode is done.
Well, we've talked a lot about creating the supportive environments for individuals with autism, especially when it comes to, physical activity and those sensory sensitivities. But I think we should broaden that out even more and consider, like, the overall design of our spaces.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. We usually talk about accessibility in terms of
Yeah.
like physical barriers, ramps, and things like that. But sensory accessibility is a whole other thing, isn't it?
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, imagine a child with auditory sensitivities, trying to handle a busy shopping mall. Or a teenager with tactile defensiveness feeling overwhelmed in a packed classroom. Those experiences can be so isolating.
Yeah, it really makes you realize that our environments can either help or hurt.
Mhm.
And I think it's on all of us to try and design spaces that are inclusive and welcoming for everyone.
Absolutely. And it goes beyond just the physical space, too. It's about creating a culture of understanding, acceptance, where people with autism feel valued.
Well said. And to our listener, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of autism and scoliosis. We hope you learned something new, maybe even gained a new perspective.
It's been great exploring this with you. And remember, knowledge is just the beginning. Let's use what we've learned to create a more inclusive world for individuals with autism and their families.
And on that note, keep exploring, keep learning, and we'll catch you on our next deep dive adventure.